Hello, friends. This is Robert Roach on the Type 1 Planet podcast, and our show and our greater organization is dedicated to designing a theoretical model for a civilization that could sustainably thrive for thousands of years into the future, and one that would not experience that historical trend that we've seen of catastrophic collapse of great ancient civilizations. Now, the more we learn from these massive historical events, the more we may be able to adapt our approach for a sustainable long-term future. And it's for that reason that I'm thrilled to have had Joseph Tainter on our show. He's an acclaimed anthropologist and historian whose groundbreaking research has transformed our understanding of societal complexity and collapse. Joseph is a professor for the Department of Environment and Society at Utah State University, and he's probably best known for his 1988 book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, which examines the dynamics and processes that lead civilizations to decay and unravel. And this work remains a key text for anyone seeking to comprehend how societies evolve, adapt, and sometimes catastrophically fail. Now, in his research, Joseph tackles big questions about civilizational stability, the ability to problem solve, the complex interplay of factors that allow civilizations to thrive or decline. And his core argument is that as civilizations evolve to solve problems, they become more complex. And this added complexity initially yields benefits and new capabilities. But over time, it requires ever more resources to sustain itself, leading to diminishing returns. And eventually, the cost of maintaining complexity overwhelms the benefits. And that sets the stage for collapse. Joseph's ability to analyze civilizations using his anthropological lens provides a unique vantage point for us. And it's been amazing speaking with him. I think you're going to love it. Now, as a side note, we were unable to use our usual video chatting platform due to tech constraints, so the audio-visual quality is slightly less than what you'll be used to. Still, I think you're going to love it. It's a fantastic conversation, so enjoy, stay curious, and please send us your feedback. Hello and welcome to the Type 1 Planet podcast. This is Robert Roach, and today I'm joined by Joseph Tainter. He's a renowned anthropologist, a historian. He's made significant contributions to the understanding of societal complexities and the mechanisms that cause a civilization to potentially collapse. And he's the author of The Collapse of Complex Societies, which is a book I just had the pleasure of listening to on Audible. I don't actually own the paperback version yet, but Joe, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
So the purpose of this podcast and the greater company behind it is to develop a theoretical model of a civilization, a global civilization that could thrive into the deep future, meaning we're exploring as a team what it would need to be true in order for our current civilization to survive and thrive into the deep future, long periods of time, 5,000 to 10,000 years. And so you can tell why we may want to get your perspective on this project. And the first thing I wanted to ask you, just for the purpose of this discussion, can you explain what makes for a complex society? And how would we categorize our current society in that framework?
Well, one of the most complex societies that have ever existed. Complexity has two elements, the structure of the society and its organization. So the two elements are what makes up the society in terms of social roles, rules, laws, organizations, governmental levels, all of the individual entities that you can point to that are the aspects of a society. These are what I call structure, the structure of the society. Combined with structure is organization, which is the way that the parts work together to make a functioning whole, to make a functioning system. This consists of cultural norms, people's beliefs. It can consist of formal rules and laws, informal ways in which people interact with each other, informal ways in which we, interact with institutions, with businesses, with government parts. So structure and organization are the twin aspects of complexity. You have to have both to have a complex system. You have to have a highly differentiated structure. In other words, a lot of parts. And the parts have to be made coherent by organization. Organization makes the parts behave together in certain ways. So the complexity consists of structure and organization. Now, it's easy to confuse complexity with complicated, which people generally understand. People understand complications in their lives. They're not necessarily the same thing. Things that are complicated are not necessarily well organized. A complex system has structure and organization.
Is there a trade-off between structure and organization? Is it possible for a very, let's say a very unstructured society, from your definition, a society that doesn't have a super complex political system, but they can be very well organized. They can be, is a hunter-gatherer society a well-organized society?
Yes. I mean, organization doesn't have to be hierarchical, and for most of human history, it hasn't been. Highly hierarchical societies are a function of, it's primarily the last 12,000 years or so since we began to become dependent on agriculture. So yes, organization can take many forms. In a hunter-gatherer society, it simply consists of how people in small bands interact with each other, their beliefs, their cultural norms, their conventional ways of working together and treating each other. In highly complex societies like ourselves, you start with that base of cultural norms and beliefs and interactions, and then you layer on top of it more formal structures and rules and laws, such as we're all familiar with.
There's two key indicators you mentioned in your book that show that a society may be complex, and that is inequality and heterogeneity. Could you explain why those are important as important markers to say that, okay, this society is probably very complex?
These are terms that a colleague of mine came up with a number of years ago, but they're consistent with what I've just been describing to you, inequality and heterogeneity. So heterogeneity is simply structure. It is a system divided into a number of parts or components. It is heterogeneous. A complex society must be heterogeneous. That's the only way it can be. Otherwise, it's not a complex society. And that organization, of course, as I say, is the way that the parts are bound together to function as a whole.
Mm. So what I really appreciated the way that you structured your book was that you took the time not to define what a complex society is, and then you took a fair amount of time to define collapse. And you have theories of collapse, and also you outline many different kinds of collapses that have happened in human history, and you pull out primary contributing factors that lead to those collapses. And I'm excited to get into those. But there's one key quote that stood out to me. It is a little out of context, obviously, but you said collapse is not intrinsically a catastrophe. And so what does this statement mean? Is it possible to have, first of all, a civilizational collapse, a complex, well-structured civilization to collapse without massive loss of life, or without setting us back so far that it takes a long time to get back to where we were?
Massive loss of life is a different issue, and if you will bring it up again later in the conversation, I can discuss it a little bit more. Not intrinsically a catastrophe. Let me give an example. In the latter days of the Roman Empire, there are actually examples of people in the colonies, the Roman provinces in Western Europe, actually inviting Germanic invaders into the Roman lands to relieve them of the burden of Roman taxes. And with the end of the Roman Empire, Roman taxes went away, and it is likely that people enjoyed better lives because of that. There would have been less security and less of other things, less trade, less interaction. But at the same time, you have to remember that 90% of people were farmers in those days. People were able to keep more of their crops, which meant they could feed their children better. And in that sense, collapse is not necessarily a catastrophe. Now, collapse is an economic function, as I have worked out in that book. To be a complex system always has a metabolic cost. We think of the cost today in terms of things like money. But if we go back to, let us say, pre-industrial days, the cost of being a complex society was basically energy, primarily, in recent centuries in the form of agriculture. So perhaps you should go back and rephrase the question. I'm getting a little off.
No, it's the reason I brought it up is because, there's all these examples in your book, but obviously I'm thinking of this in the framework of the civilization that we live in today, and the civilization that my child will live in, in his lifetime. And from that perspective, selfishly, I don't want for our civilization to collapse. But yes, I am a part of that civilization. There might be uncontacted tribes, for example, that, maybe the class of our civilization makes their quality of life better. And so I was trying to better understand what you meant by that phrase. And there was another quotation that I found striking, and I really loved it. You wrote, "Every time history repeats itself, the price goes up." And maybe that is a better kind of quotation to get your clarification on. What do you mean by this phrase, that the price goes up, and what do you estimate the price of a modern day collapse would be?
Well, that was mostly a humorous statement. So let me talk more about, specifically about complexity. Complexity always has a cost. Complexity is not free. In the biological world, more complex organisms have a higher metabolic requirement than do simple organisms. And the same is true in human societies. More complex societies have a higher energy requirement than simpler societies do. And it's a higher cost per capita per person. Now, we're largely unaware of this today because to us, complexity appears to be free. We pay for complexity through fossil fuels. So we're largely unaware of it, except when we go to a gas station to fill up our car. But other than that, we're not aware that complexity has a cost. People in the past understood it, although they couldn't have expressed it quite the way we do today. But as societies, particularly from the beginning of agriculture about 12,000 years ago, as they grew in size and complexity and interaction with other societies, the cost of being such societies increased until you get to the point where you have formal state organizations that impose taxes on people. And as the size of state organizations would grow, particularly with the cost of supporting armies, the level of taxation would go up. And this is very clear in the later Roman Empire that simply the cost of being the Roman Empire went up, and it resulted in the imposition of higher taxes on the agricultural population. But I want to go back to the point that I was trying to make before, and that's that complexity is not intrinsically good or bad. Complexity increases, as I've argued throughout the book, complexity increases to solve problems, and it works. Complexity can be used to solve problems. It's not intrinsically good or bad. It's either useful and affordable, or it isn't.
Yeah, this is a key part of your book, is that the investment in sociopolitical complexity, we're investing in sociopolitical complexity as a problem solver, as something that, for example, we can find cures for diseases. We can do a rapid response to a pandemic. We can decrease poverty or infant mortality on a global scale. And one of the big elements of your book is that as we invest more and more into sociopolitical complexity, it starts to have diminishing returns. And I wanted to, it's something that we all kind of see around us in our culture, that we keep getting more and more complex, but we're not, let's just say from a personal satisfaction perspective, people seem to be less and less happy as they're stacking more and more technology on top of technology in their lives. Where do these diminishing returns come from? And why is it that this is such a prevalent trend through human history?
Humans first pluck the low-lying fruit. This is invariant. Now, in the case of complexity of societies, we first evolved simple, low-cost societies, hunter-gatherer bands, and in these societies, anthropologists studying, for example, the Bushmen of Southern Africa in the 1960s, found that these people, these hunter-gatherer bands, actively work not to become hierarchical, to keep their societies as simple as they can. So we first evolved the simplest, least cost institutions, and then we evolved from those as we need to solve problems and develop complex solutions to problems, increasingly complex solutions to problems. Complexity increases and the cost of complexity goes up. So it's purely a function of first adopting the simplest solutions that we're aware of and that seem to work, that seem to do the job. But then we're always building more complex and more costly solutions on top of those. So it's a matter of, as I say, always plucking the low-lying fruit.
Mm. And as you continue to invest, let's say we have a limited energy resource, like you were referring to fossil fuels. As you continue to invest, you need to start pulling. Is it that you need to start pulling resources away from the? One point you pointed out is that when a stressor occurs, you need to redirect resources to deal with that stressor. COVID-19 pandemic is maybe a good example. And then that can have negative future implications if you redirect those resources in such a way where now we're investing less in our problem-solving capabilities. How is it that, like production capacity or our ability to react to a stressor, how is it that it's difficult to describe this question. We're starting to get into the thick of it here. Let's take the COVID-19 pandemic as an example. What was your assessment of how we reacted to the pandemic? We had a major global stressor, large new productions of, let's say, PPE and medicines and that kind of stuff. What was your reaction to that? And do you see that we will have negative future implications because of that reaction?
I like historical comparisons. So let's go back to the Black Death of the 14th century. In response to the Black Death, medical science as it existed in those days had to become more complex. The base of knowledge had to grow, and so practitioners had to learn new things and learn ways to cope with what was a new malady. Now, if you look at COVID today, we've gone through the same thing. Medical science has become more complex. The organization of our societies has become more complex. In some societies, let's say in like Italy, very strict controls were imposed on people. These are an aspect of being a complex society, and they're costly. In some ways, there was an opportunity cost in that with people locked into their apartments, there are certain businesses that suffered and certain economic functions that simply couldn't be conducted as they usually are. So, COVID is a very clear example of how stress causes increase in complexity, causes complexity to grow. Now, one of the things I have noticed about in the response to COVID, and this is something that, I'm not a psychologist, so I can't really speak on this authoritatively, but COVID clearly affected people in ways that have never really been made explicit. But if you know what to look for, you can see how stressed people were by having their assumptions about the world suddenly yanked out from under them. This is shocking for me. Most people don't consider the possibility that the way we live could not just automatically go on forever and maybe get better. And in fact, COVID showed us that the way we live is not guaranteed, that things can happen to cause us to have to curtail aspects of how we live. And I think this contributed to some of the political reactions to COVID that people simply could not accept the fact that that there was a need for curtailments in the way of life. And really, particularly in the United States, the activities we had to curtail were really very minor. But people don't know history, so they don't understand that. You go back to, let's say, the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, if there was an outbreak of plague in a city, the city's gates would be closed and locked. No one would be allowed in, no one would be allowed out. That is how those societies had to cope with disease outbreaks, with epidemics. Today, we have COVID, and we didn't have. I mean, it really isn't possible. You can't lock the city gates anymore. But air travel was restricted. Travel between countries was restricted. In some nations, such as Italy, people were told to stay home. You should not leave your apartment except maybe to buy food, and then you go straight back. Here, the restrictions that we faced were, I think, fairly minor. But the stress on people's psyches, it's clear, at least to me, and let me tell you why I say that. There are many years now since the Collapse book came out. I've done a few of these interviews per year. What I noticed in the aftermath of COVID is that I'm getting more requests to do these interviews about stress in societies. No, that's anecdotal. It's just my personal experience. I can't really quantify it, and it's not like I'm not a famous person. I don't do a lot of interviews per year, but I do. I've always done a handful, and now that handful has grown a little larger. It's simply an example of how people responded to having their lives disrupted by a violation of the unconscious assumption that the way we live just automatically goes on and on.
And we're particularly sensitive to reductions in standard of living, I feel. Our society, our civilization is built on, capitalism itself is built on increasing standards of living. And, I think you note this as well in your writing, is that when you invest in complexity, when you invest in research and development, it does require less investment in standard of living inherently. And you need to have some sort of collective agreement to reduce those standards of living, or you need a dictatorship, a collective agreement or dictatorship, right? And from my perspective, it seems somewhat impossible, just given basic game theory, to have collective agreement work unilaterally. And I think we did experience that during COVID.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And reductions in standard of living cause societal stress and political conflict. I am a member of the baby boom generation, and people my age, I've often heard them say that we were the first generation in American history to live less well than our parents. I don't know whether that's economically true. Certainly, in some ways, we've come to live better than our parents did. But it's how people feel. It's how people perceive stress in their lives and the violation of the assumptions of their lives.
So, bringing us back to diminishing returns on investment, the more diminishing the returns, the closer the society is potentially to decay or to collapse. How does a society, let's say historically, maybe let's take an historical example, how does a society enter a new cycle of increasing return on investment in complexity? Do you have any examples from our history?
Well, collapse is one way to do that, but it's not one that we want to experience.
No, we're trying to avoid it, Joe. We're trying to... No. Yeah.
There are possibilities. None of them is simple or automatic. When I give talks and people ask me a question like that, I like to say the first step is awareness. The first step is being aware of how complexity grows, because usually we aren't. Complexity generally grows by small steps, each of which seems reasonable and affordable at the time. It's the cumulative costs that do the damage. So, talking as an academic here, and I know this is unrealistic, it would be good if people had a better knowledge of the long-term history of societies like ours, and how they grow and evolve and encounter problems over time. Now, as far as a revolution goes, we have experienced them. The biggest one was, of course, the Industrial Revolution, and in particular, the development of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels allowed us to break the long-term constraints, or many of the long-term constraints under which humanity had labored since our species emerged. That with fossil fuels, industrialization was made possible. Our system of scientific research and development, economic development, technological development, those things were all made possible because of fossil fuels. Now, it's part of our, well, what an anthropologist would call an ancestor myth, that we think of the way we live today as something that we achieved through hard work and innovation. And I don't want to downplay those things. Certainly you can admire the hard work and innovation that we have accomplished in recent centuries. But none of that would have made any difference without fossil fuels. People in the past were highly innovative and very intelligent, but without a nearly inexhaustible energy source, they simply couldn't achieve a real breakthrough in their way of life. So the breakthrough came with fossil fuels. And we have to ask now, are we approaching the end of that cycle? Are we approaching the end of that revolution?
So this is the energy subsidy that you refer to. What would a technology like fusion power, let's say incredibly cheap, incredibly available amounts of power from fusion, what would that potentially do to our civilization?
Yeah, that was what I get. I'm not a physicist, but there's what I gather was an important breakthrough in fusion research. When you look at the statistics of it, it looks like a really tiny amount of positive energy. But the assumption or the hope is that maybe that could be scaled up to ultimately to something that could power complex societies. I don't know. What I will say is that there's always a constraint or more constraints. If energy stops being our primary constraint, there will be other constraints. Something else will emerge. Right now with our transition to battery-powered vehicles, electric vehicles, the constraint seems to be some of the minerals that go into lithium-ion batteries. Mm-hmm. And part of that constraint seems to be political because a lot of these, the supply is controlled by China. And people should be worried about that. The government should be worried about that, that if our society does indeed become dependent on electric vehicles, and that comes to be what most people drive, we need a continuing supply of those minerals for lithium-ion batteries. Will that continue? It's uncertain, but even if fusion should provide us with unimaginable abundant source amounts of energy, something else will be the constraint. There are always limits.
Interesting. Yeah, speaking of inequality, it takes a lot of inequality to get those miners down into those mines to pull out the materials we use for batteries. So that's also an interesting conundrum we face as a civilization, is how much suffering goes into creating those devices. Now, you in your book, you outlined 11, I think, primary contributing factors that lead to collapse. And we do not need to go through all of them. I wanted to ask you, of the primary contributing factors that lead to collapse, what are most relevant? For my project, let's say you're talking to me, you're saying, oh, you want to make a theoretical model. I would look at these factors as the most relevant to our current day civilization. And are there any factors that you list there that are totally unique to our civilization, like existential risks from artificial intelligence or nuclear war or something like that?
Well, artificial intelligence is certainly another increase in complexity, and we don't know how it's going to turn out. But the discussion today of trying to constrain it or delay it is just not going to work. You can't stop it, and we're going to have to cope with it. Now, it's important. You look at artificial intelligence, and there's a tendency to think, oh, this will make our lives easier and better. But it's and so maybe your lives don't become more complex. No, the important thing to understand about complexity is that complexity simplifies. As you elaborate structure and organization, you simplify and channel behavior. That's how complexity works to respond to problems. And so, your question about what aspects of complexity should we be most concerned about? That varies with different historical periods, with different kinds of societies, and even on a shorter-term basis with the challenges that we face from day to day, challenges in the international arena, challenges in the domestic arena. These things all vary between time and place.
Okay. Interesting. If you were to rewrite this book today, 33 years later, what would you change or adjust in your focus? Would you change your approach in any way?
No. I could actually give you some ideas because I've been writing down some ideas for how people could cope with complexity.
Oh, yeah, please.
I'll be the first person to hear them, you and your audience.
Oh, cheer! Yes. All right. Awesome.
I won't tell them all to you, but I'll tell you some of them. As I've said, the first step, the most fundamental step, is always be aware. Be aware of how and why complexity grows and what its consequences can be. And this, in part, means learning history. I like to think that if I was, say, 40 years younger and know what I know now, I might spend more time talking to, say, K-12 educators to put more emphasis on getting children to understand our long-term history as a species, because that's a fundamental step. One thing that's been proposed, not original with me, but a couple of people have proposed it, is take small steps. Don't try to adopt enormous, large solutions to problems. Change gradually. Take small steps. And perfect example is biological evolution, which proceeds by small steps and has generally been successful in the history of life on Earth. But one thing that comes up from time to time, of course, is cost-benefit analysis. I like the term full cost accounting. I don't need to go into this because it's widely recognized. The problem with cost-benefit analysis for complexity is that it's hard to foresee what the long-term consequences of complexity are going to be. And so this is always a constraint. Monitor energy, and don't necessarily rely on innovation, because the research that I've been doing lately in complexity focuses on the productivity of innovation, the productivity of our system of innovation. And what my colleagues and I have shown is that the productivity of our system of innovation is actually declining. And we're largely unaware of this today because if you go into an electronic store or go online, you can always find new widgets to buy. But with some colleagues, we did a study of long-term trends in the patents database. And, we worked with a database of over 3 million patents. And what we've shown is that beginning in about, say, 1974 or so, the productivity of our system of innovation has declined by over 20%. And that's in the course of a generation. The reason goes back to plucking the low-lying fruit. Back in the 19th century, research was the province of lone wolf naturalists, like Charles Darwin, Gregor Mendel, and so forth. Research, and they addressed very fundamental principles that became the basis of much of subsequent science. But those basic principles have largely been discovered. And so science has to move to narrower and narrower fields of inquiry which gradually become more and more interdisciplinary. And so innovation today, research today is largely done by interdisciplinary teams rather than by individual lone wolf naturalists. Going back on my own history, going back to, say, the 1970s, see, my PhD was 1975. I remember in those days, one could pick up a copy of, let's say, the journal Science and look at an average article, and there'd be a single author per paper. If you go to those journals today, there are multiple authors per paper. This is now the norm. This is now commonplace. I see it when we advertise a faculty position here at Utah State University. I look at the applications that come in and the publishing records of applicants, and they're all multi-authored papers. Whereas, in my day, when one applied for a university position, one presented one's own publications as the accomplishments. And so science grows complex. It grows complex and it grows costly. And so this is one of the reasons why I say don't necessarily rely on innovation to bail us out in the future.
That's interesting. Yeah, it seems like it can't be a good mechanism to rely on if those complex structures especially are falling apart. My co-founder and she's my wife as well. She's a geneticist, and she traveled to London to do experiments. She traveled to other parts of the country, and then she has a whole bunch of co-authors on her thesis, and it's a incredibly complex process. I wanted to bring you back to learning about history. I had got a taste for it after reading your book. I read another book called The Lessons of History. Following that, the author, incredibly famous person who is totally slipping my mind right now. My question for you is, if you were to talk to a young person, let's say in high school or about to exit high school, what books would you say, start here, read these 3 books, and then see where you want to go from there? Would you have any recommendations along those lines?
Well, that's quite hard. I think I need to think about that a bit before I could answer. I'm glancing over at a bookshelf now. I'm looking at 2 books, which aren't necessarily the most important ones. There's a book called The Great Wave by a historian named Fisher, which concerns Christ's revolutions in the past. And its value is just that it illustrates the value of learning history and understanding history. There's another book I'm looking at called Heat, Power, and Light, which concerns the evolution of energy. It's hard to say that there's a single book that one should read, but I would just say read history, particularly read long-term history, long-term historical changes, and just get a sense of history, a sense of what we can know from history. That's offhand, that's the best advice I could give.
Okay. The Great Wave, Heat, Power, and Light. And, I'm going to include those in the show notes. By the way, The Lessons of History by Will Durant and Ariel Durant. And that audiobook was great too, because in between the chapters, there's interviews with Will and Ariel, and they start arguing about history, and it's charming. Little side note there. Well, this has been wonderful, Joe, and I really appreciate your time today. I also hope that I can stay in touch with you in the future. This is a really complex project that we're taking on, and I don't know where it's going to go or what shape it's going to take, but we might want to get your feedback and maybe your advisement on the project as it moves along without taking too much of your time. So I might reach out again in the future and see maybe we can do something like that.
That's fine. Tell me, what is the project?
Yeah, so Type 1 Planet we're attempting to create a theoretical model. So for right now, if you do the math on our current global civilization, just energy use as one of those factors, put aside agriculture, for example, The math on our civilization doesn't work for a 10,000 year timeline. We maybe we can become more and more efficient at pulling fossil fuels out of the ground. But the way that we're structured right now, it will be some sort of societal collapse. And the thing that we're working with here is not knowing what would happen after a collapse like that. How much of a cost we would pay for that. And so what we're trying to do right now is using the technologies and tools that we have at our current disposal, without assuming the invention of fusion energy, for example. Is it possible to create a theoretical model that even the math, but everything else would work for a long-term existence? And as we create that model, as we say, okay, well, we would need, let's say, with current population growth lines, we would need this amount of food, this amount of energy. How is it that we could create that many calories? How is it that we can create that much energy? And that's where we start to pull in scientists, entrepreneurs, researchers, professors, authors who are doing this kind of work. We're talking to people who are trying to pull microplastics out of water. We're talking to people who are creating urban farming technology where, they're building acres and acres of farmland inside of storage containers that can go on top of parking garages. And, we build that model and then we start plugging these technologies and these ideas and these concepts in, see if we can fill the holes. And what we do with that model is a good question. But I think the proof of concept is something that we're working on first. So it'll be interesting to maybe run something by you one day and say, oh, what's your instinct on this kind of model? And I don't know what kind of form that would take. If it would be a book, it's definitely taking the form of a podcast right now, and maybe documentaries. I don't know. We're working on it.
Very good. Sounds like a very worthwhile project. Good luck with it.
I appreciate you, and I appreciate your time and your feedback, and hope to be in contact with you again soon. This has been wonderful.
Very good.